Okay, I got the thumbs up. Oh, I'm echoing. It's really lovely to see how many people are here. I'm a bit taken aback. Thank you for coming and wanting to hear what we have to say. I say we because I am Amy-Leigh Shaw. I won't do that again, I promise, audio person. I'm sorry. I'm a writer and narrative designer at Sweet Baby Inc. I'll figure this out. I'm Amy. I'm a writer and narrative designer at Sweet Baby Inc. And Sweet Baby Inc. is a company that is almost entirely writers and narrative designers. We work with a lot of different studios. We engage with them in their writers' rooms on their narratives, their characters, their stories, and the things they want to say with their games. We are working with lots of different projects currently, around 15. So that being said, we get to see a lot of writers' rooms. We're a big team, and one of the other members of that team is Paula. Paula is going to be joining me on screen, hopefully any second now. And Paula is going to introduce herself the same way I've just introduced myself.
Great. Hello. Can you hear me? Okay. Hi, I'm Paula Rogers. I also am a writer and narrative designer at Sweet Baby, as Amy-Leigh mentioned. I'm based in Austin, Texas. I'm sorry I can't be there with you all in person, but I also get the privilege of not seeing how many of you there are, and I can just give my talk to the birds outside my window and pretend that they're telling me what a genius I am. So, I have been a writer for almost 20 years. I started in journalism at the NPR affiliate in San Francisco. From there, I moved into book publishing. I worked in advertising, TV, film, and then games. In the game space, I worked on NeoCabs, probably the game that you might have heard of, where I was a writing lead. I designed and ran that pipeline of anywhere from like 5 to 10 writers kind of all over the world. We were an entirely remote team. And I've been with Sweet Baby for about 4 years, doing many of the things that Amy-Leigh mentioned.
Yeah, I think it would be helpful for us to get into a little bit of how we're set up at Sweet Baby. And I think Paula will be able to speak a little bit to the fact that, like, we have so many projects. Not every person that works at Sweet Baby is on every project. We have teams within Sweet Baby that will go on to different projects. And each individual will have a few different projects they work on, and they will go from meeting to meeting through the day. It's a really lovely way to work. It means that for 1 hour, you might be working on, for instance, a very cute indie project, and then the next hour you might go into a first-person shooter and work on characters in there. And yeah, Paula, is there anything like you kind of want to add to the way we work and how you think it kind of helps us get a feel for writers' rooms in different spaces?
Well, I think we can jump into our conversation about the things we want to cover. So I mentioned the kind of all the different industries I've worked in to show that I've worked in a lot of different collaborative writing spaces. And so we're here to talk about our best practices, what we've learned, that we've seen, and that we put in action in our current job in Sweet Baby. So Amy-Leigh, what would you say is the first kind of mental hurdle in rethinking how to approach writing when you want to have a collaborative or a writer's room based approach to your narrative?
So for me, and I know that we've discussed this a lot, especially in preparation for this, it sounds simple to say, but one of the most important things about going into a writer's room is that you acknowledge yourself as not only the individual in that space, and getting yourself sort of away from this idea of authorship, and the idea that you are the person that came up with this idea, you are the person that made this character, and instead integrating yourself into this idea that you're a room, you're a team, and you're working together. So I feel like you get a really good sense of that in a writer's room, and I think in terms of authorship, it's a challenge when you first enter writers' rooms to separate yourself from, you're so excited that you're the one finally writing, right? That there's a temptation to immediately be like, I wrote that, it's mine. Did you ever like kind of feel that when you first started out, Paula?
Absolutely. Yeah, I think rethinking that auteur expectation is is such a real thing because I think a lot of us have this myth of the writer as this solitary genius who then just like delivers their words perfectly formed. And that's never been true, you know, really, not even in book publishing where editors do a lot of the work. So I think getting yourself like kind of distance from this idea that to be a good writer you have to show that you're able to do so much on your own, you're able to be this like one person genius. That's not where actually the strength and cachet as a writer and the value as a writer for people who are looking to hire them actually comes from, because especially in games, which is so collaborative and multidisciplinary, writing is collaborative. And as Amy was saying, I think one of the challenges is balancing ego, essentially. Like we're creatives, we're sensitive, and we like to know like that our ideas are exciting or good, that we're having an individual impact, and balancing that with the idea that you are on a team and you're all creating something together. It's not just your baby. It's something that we're going to be talking about today.
Yeah, and I mean, I think you hit on something really important though with this idea that when you're in a room and everyone sees themselves as an individual and as the writer, it also distances you from being able to like interact with other teams as well. And something that I've found is like the best writers' rooms, the most collaborative writers' rooms, are also much more able to engage in an interdisciplinary way, and I'm much more comfortable with inviting people from different teams and different disciplines into that room in a way that means that you get to have conversations about how narrative can affect the character art, narrative can affect the audio design, and how do we work together to really integrate what we're trying to say with our game into every aspect of the way that we present it. Yeah.
So I guess we'll start with talking about the benefits of collaborative writing. I think that it's very common in a lot of other disciplines to think of it as a writer's room, but maybe not so much in games. And so I'll start and then I'll throw to you, Amy-Leigh, to talk about this collaboratively. But the obvious one is that you get stronger character voices. People are infinitely complex, and even the most brilliant writers can benefit from characters that are multidimensional, that have different perspectives that are informing them. And this goes beyond, you know, obviously representation and demographics, but even to emotional complexity. How do we see beyond our own blinders just from a behavioral, psychological standpoint? And so opening up your character development to contributions from others, and not even just in terms of notes, but in terms of actually creating that character, the bio for that character, or even that character's voice, it can make a stronger character. And also for the writer, selfishly, it kind of takes the pressure off you a little bit. It makes it so that you're like, well, this isn't, if it is totally terrible, it's not completely my fault. And it gives you some kind of confidence that this character means something, not just to you, but to all the other brilliant people that are in the room with you.
Yeah, I
Amy,
think that
what would you say?
confidence. Well, so I think that confidence is the freedom to be a bit sillier. I'm like a massive, Paula will know that, anyone that has worked with me will know, I'm a really big advocate of being silly in rooms, in that I like to be a goof in rooms. And it's intentional because I think only when we can acknowledge that messing around when we're talking about story and characters is work, only then do we actually get comfortable in really exploring who a character is, for example. Like it's only when you ask, for instance, like Did Zangief from Street Fighter go to see the Barbie movie? Have a conversation about that. And it might feel silly, and you might feel like it's nothing and nonsense, and it never actually makes it into the script. But everyone in that room who had that conversation now has a better understanding of who Zangief is and what does he see at the movies. It's rich for kind of exploration. But I think something I kind of want to talk and then get your opinion on, Paula, is the idea of being the owner of a character. So I'm going to hypothetically just do Street Fighter for all of this because I've thought of it now and my head is otherwise empty. If I'm a writer on a Street Fighter game and I happen to write all of Zangief's lines, suddenly I feel like I own Zangief's character and the way that he speaks and what he says, and I am the person to come to if you want to know about Zangief, right? When actually that might feel really important and like you have like a big responsibility, but it's also a big responsibility. Like when you're the owner of a character, A, that reflects you entirely, but B, suddenly everything about that character is on you. And kind of like you were saying, Paula, you don't get to kind of bounce things off people and spread that decision making and all get to have these characters that you work on together. I kind of want to, how do you feel about that?
I could not agree more. I think that's such an excellent point. It's the benefit and also the challenge of collaborative writing. For instance, on NeoCab, this ended up being a game that was almost 100,000 words. And as I mentioned, we had anywhere from 5 to 10 writers who were kind of cycling in and out of the project on a freelance basis across multiple time zones. But it was also a single protagonist, dialogue-driven game, which meant that protagonist, Lena, had to sound like she was one person written by one person when she was actually written in fits and starts by several. And so that is a difficult thing to do. How do you make sure that a team of writers who have never physically been in the same space can internalize a character to such an extent that my job as the lead isn't constantly rewriting their lines because it doesn't sound like Lena, because Lena only lives in my head. Not only is that too much work for me, it's incredibly demoralizing for my writers because they're going to be like, well, you're rewriting everything. I don't care anymore. So I knew that we had to do something to foster co-ownership, and as I said, that each writer would internalize Lena. So when we did have our virtual writers' rooms, I made space for exactly what Amy-Leigh is talking about, which was productive play. Having sessions where the writers could say, like, exercises that I stole basically from theater, which were like, what would Lena dream about? Let's write like a 5-minute writing exercise. No bad ideas. What were her dreams about? What's a memory from her childhood? What's something that she takes with her everywhere she goes, everywhere she moves? Things like that. I had no intention of ever having them be in the game. They were just character building exercises, again borrowed from theater, where that actor has to have a personal connection and understanding to that role to inhabit them, and it's much the same as for a writer. And this worked really well, and I think it, as Amy-Leigh said, it brought facets to that character that did end up coming into the game, not just from the person who wrote the dream about Lena being chased by a dinosaur or whatever, but then when I would be working on something and I'd be like, oh, Andrew had that great idea about Lena being chased by a dinosaur. I'm going to write that into a little mine. And suddenly, there were like 5 or 6 different pieces that had this dinosaur mentioned, and that feels like a real character. And every person got to feel like this was something we were all creating together when we all shared Lena's dreams and talked about them.
I think that's the flip side to that feeling, right? That what Paula described of the feeling of like having a lead writer who is the one who knows the character and rewrites all your stuff, and it's very disheartening and very it can be harsh. The flip side of that is that when you get in a room and everyone knows the voice And you might be having a completely unrelated conversation about what somebody did this weekend, and somebody says a sentence, and somebody's like, oh my goodness, that's exactly what Zangief would say. And everyone laughs because they all know, yeah, that is exactly what Zangief would say. And you get that moment of kind of togetherness as a team. But I think what I wanted to add to what Paula said was thinking about that and that frame of like the group and everyone having those moments together. I think there's a lot to be said, especially in an industry that wants to bring more juniors in and get more young people into rooms and into spaces. When you have collaborative rooms and when you have rooms where people genuinely are on a level and all have equal understanding of characters and story and what's happening, you give junior team members a chance to connect, not necessarily with the product they're making, but with the other people in that room. And you give them the opportunity to learn from all those other people. I mean, I can speak a lot for the first project I ever worked on, the first project I ever was a writer on. It was seeing the more senior writers and reading their writing for a long time before I was brought onto the team as a writer that informed the voice that I still write in. Because they treated me very equally, and I had the chance to see how they write and how they process and start to incorporate that into my own process. And it really helped me grow a lot faster. But that kind of gets onto our next point, Paula, right? Which is, okay, we've decided we all don't want to be individuals like owning our own territory of games. So how do we stop doing that? And how do we have a healthy writer's room, right?
Yes, fostering co-ownership. We've touched on this a little bit already, but I will just reiterate because I do think it's important to say, as we're maintaining a good ecosystem, maintaining that kind of sense of play and camaraderie, as Amy-Leigh's talking about, but I think balancing that with what I had mentioned, where creative people still do need to feel pride and a sense of accomplishment. We do enjoy seeing that our voice is making it into the game, making it onto the page. That's why we all do this. So it's a balance of we're all in this together, but also my contribution matters. I think we had discussed, when we were prepping for this, that this idea of being cooperative and collaborative feels good. You're part of a team. Feeling like you're interchangeable on that team feels bad. So how do you balance the need for your creatives, your writers to feel like I see this individual person, everyone has a contribution and everyone matters, and we're also all in it together and no one is like the star or hogging the spotlight. So that's what we're going to talk about now.
Yeah, and I mean, I kind of wanted to add to that a little bit more and talk about that idea of like teammates rather than like just people in a room together, and that interchangeability idea of, I think sometimes people see like a lead or a senior team member and assume that they are the person who is looking out for people's strengths. But I would kind of say, you should really be looking out no matter where you are on the team for what your teammates' strengths are. First of all, because it means that when you need help with something, you know exactly who to go to help you out. But second of all, one day you might not be a team member. One day you might also be a senior or a lead on a project. It happens very often at our company because we have lots of teams and lots of writers' rooms. Those teams are differently structured in every project we work on. Somebody who is just a writer on one project might be a lead on another project, right? And so having paid attention to who else is in the room with you, when you do get to that role where you are the person figuring out who has the strengths, who to give this task to, because you know what people's strengths are. You have remembered, oh, actually, this person wrote a paper on this specific type of dragon from 18th century literature. I should bring them in for this game about 18th century dragons, I think always being aware of not just your strengths, but the strengths of everyone in the room makes you a much stronger collaborator.
Yes, absolutely. Yes, I completely agree with that. That's goes such a long way to making people feel seen, as if I was like, you remembered my dragon paper, Amy-Leigh. That would be wonderful, and I would feel like such a great boost from that. Um, so in terms of like actual models that you can put in place if you're building a writer's room, we can just talk a little bit about some kind of more practical tips or structures. I think, we there's the idea that the collaboration comes from notes more than actual generating the ideas or the actual writing on the page. And I think that's like where a lot of people start with collaboration. And we want to kind of encourage you to think about that collaboration can be the creative part itself. You can generate text, you can generate dialogue collaboratively. It's not just about editing. So like one model that I've used is stubs. And this is the idea that you just write your script in the most functional dialogue ever. Joe says, I hate you. Anna says, but I love you. Things that they would never actually say, just the function of the sentence or the worst version of it. And then I would write that scene as a stub, pass it off to a junior writer. This was a project where this writer, it was their very first game that they'd ever worked on. And so they really needed those stubs. And they were able to then take the character bios, the character voices that we had worked on together, and apply those to the stubs that I had written for them. And that worked so well. And it was such a joy for me to be like, oh, I have 17 scenes to write, but I really only have to write half of them. That felt really good. So the stubs model is one way that I've seen actual collaboration in the creative process work. Amy, do you have other models or structures that you've seen?
Yeah, so I mean, we talked about this a little bit beforehand, and I think that was one of your favorite models. One of my favorite that I've experienced is caveated with it was led by a very good lead. Getting in a meeting together on a scene and literally writing the scene together, but not with the structure that like you start with a blank page and it's like, okay, well, what happens at the beginning of the scene, and then what happens, and then what happens, because no one wants to talk when people do that, but more of a sense of we get together, we have a script page open, we talk through what happens in the scene, and usually out of that discussion, a funny bit will come out of it, or a really good line that someone says offhand, and then suddenly, without anyone having to do any individual brain work, you have the beginning of a scene, and it doesn't very often end up that you have a finished and polished scene out of that process, but what you end up with, kind of like an alternate version of yours, is really good stubs. Like you might have some lines that are duds that need to be rewritten, but then a handful of them are like finished, mint, let's go. And it really helps. Like once you have those really good lines in, you start to be able to build out the good lines in other places. I love a group script. It's one of my favorites.
Yes, another model that I've used and seen work very well, especially if you have a game with a lot of characters. I worked on a game that had 12 characters, and it was me and two other writers. So we created the characters, the bios together. And then when it came time every week or every 2 weeks to be like, okay, who wants to write? I'm going to divvy up these 12 characters, these 12 stories. I didn't want to say that each writer was attached to a character, like Amy-Leigh's point earlier, especially because it was a game. So some of the characters were like villains. Some of them were like, I didn't want to have that be tied to each writer. And it's not as fun. All the characters, there's so many different personalities. So I kind of left it up to my two writers to see which character they were kind of vibing or feeling, or which story beat for that character they were feeling that week. And so between these 12 characters, week to week, there would be like a flow back and forth. Oh, I'm writing Sam, and then next week my other writer's writing Sam, and oh, I really like the kind of edge that they found in Sam's voice when now Sam's next part of the story goes to the third writer and that gets integrated. And it worked really well because we were always reviewing each other's work. So no one was the keeper of the voice. We all kind of created the like Sam character together. But then going back and forth week to week was really nice. And if a writer was like, you know what, I'm still vibing with Sam, I want to keep going on this, that's fine too. But that worked really well, especially when there were so many characters. So that was like just to repeat the model of like we all created the character as a bio kind of together, and then sharing the writing back and forth. I've found that worked really well.
Yeah. So I think as my last point on this section, I'd actually love to talk about how, while you might not want strict roles on a team, you might not want to be like, this is the person that works on this, I don't know, building this section of the box forever. It is a good idea to have flexible roles in place just to give people the sense of responsibility and ownership that they need in a space where they aren't finding that ownership over a character or a chapter, for example. By giving people an acknowledgement of the strength that you've seen in them, and why they're on the team. Like we did this example with cricket when we talked about it through, and no, we didn't. We did it with, what's the American?
Baseball. And you very wisely were like, Paula, don't use that.
But I think it is a good example because I think on sports teams, you have players that are picked because of specific strengths they have in specific moments. Someone on a football team, that's a good sport to choose for this room, might be a good striker, right? And I think it applies the same way to writers' rooms in a very flexible way. Somebody on one project might be your dragons person, right? And you should acknowledge that for them. You should give them that responsibility of like, hey, so on this one, we really want you to be on point with the dragon stuff. So anytime it comes up, if you could kind of look over that and give notes on it. And then that way you set an expectation and you can check in with that expectation. When someone writes 10 barks about smacking a dragon on the nose and that person might forget, for example, to check in those barks and say, oh, actually, an 18th century knight would never smack a dragon on the nose or something. Well, then when that doesn't happen, your production team or you can step in and be like, hey, how are you feeling? Do you want to check these notes? You're the person with that responsibility on this project. And it keeps people kind of feeling involved and like they have a role to play in the team. Does that sound like a good thing to kind of, should we go into like individual things that you can do to be nice?
I think that sounds great. I would like to talk more about dragons, but I guess we can't.
No, we can't. I will.
Okay.
Being nice, not dragons, Paula. Being nice.
So I hope that we haven't had a lot of these experiences, but I suspect that we've all been in collaborative situations that are uncomfortable or that don't feel great. This is the reality of it can happen. As I said, people are infinitely complex. And so sometimes it can be uncomfortable. So we want to talk about that, and we want to talk about some best practices to kind of establish like some healthy guidelines, and then also like what do you do if you have bad actors? How do you mitigate that and foster healthy dynamics? So I'll start with like a very obvious good thing and a very obvious bad thing. So a do would be if you present your criticism as a question. I really believe this very strongly. It's such a simple thing to do, but it's such a powerful thing to do. Instead of like, this reads as, clunky, or this character would never do that, always assuming that the writer is very smart, very good at what they do, because they're your peer or you hired them. So they're going to be good at their job. and being very generous to your collaborators and giving them the benefit of the doubt when you're talking about their work. It can help. It mitigates defensiveness. It creates good vibes, and it's also just a way to get to what the writer actually meant. If something isn't working on the page, it's it's probably because they need a little help to find it. And so asking the writer their intent instead of just assuming their intent and that it didn't work is incredibly helpful. So yeah, presenting criticisms as questions, I think is a good one. And then that's a do, and then a don't would be oversharing, overly personal anecdotes. I think that's a pet peeve of mine in writers' rooms. And it's tricky because we are fostering like community and camaraderie, and we are sharing our experiences. That's the point, and that's the valuable stuff. But I think knowing when you're sharing something, a personal anecdote that is informative to the character or to the story, or if it's coming from a place that's about you or in putting the spotlight on you, and it can become, stealing too much of the oxygen in the room can happen. So I think being aware of that impulse that can sometimes happen in writers' rooms where sharing becomes a kind of currency, and making sure that what you're sharing, it isn't therapy, it is a job. And so keeping it kind of tied to your story objectives.
Yeah, I kind of want to talk about that as a chronic over talker, and how I kind of deal with that, because it is a temptation for me to just say stuff because, I remembered a thing and it's kind of connected to what they just said, and now I want to say it, and if I don't say it, I might die. I have to stop that a lot because I'm so excited. I want to connect with people, and like Paula said, we're there to connect in this room. And the kind of rule I keep for myself that I find really helpful, it's less about oversharing, is talking about scary things. By all means, talk about death, talk about relationships, talk about all that stuff. You have to write about it. But at the end of sharing that piece of information, can you say a sentence about it that links it back to something productive for the script and the story? Like, can you share this piece of information about yourself and say, and I think that's really applicable for this character because of their experience of X. So maybe we should consider doing this with them, given that that's how I responded in this situation. And then you get to foster a discussion rather than a moment of like, oh, that happened to you, you know? It's linking it back and kind of getting it to a space where it moves everyone forwards. And speaking of moving forwards, given that I kind of stole your don't, I'm going to give one of my own, which is, for me, you hear people talk about yes and a lot in improvisation, right? I'm going to say, pick a yes and over a no because. And when I say that, what I mean is, I think especially in the circumstances we've talked about where people get very individually tied to a specific scenario that they came up with and they love, they hear any deviation of that or any kind of thing that they see as like a movement away from that, and they go, no. And it can kind of stop a room in its tracks, and everyone has to kind of be like, oh, they didn't like that. And it stifles everyone then being able to talk about other adjustments and growths that they can make to that kind of scene. And I think a healthier way to do that, if you can learn it for yourself and practice it yourself, because you are going to hear people make suggestions that can, like, conjunct with an idea you had and be like, my idea. Instead of the no, try and get yourself to a place where it's like, okay, I see what you're saying about this, so yes, and my idea was this, so there's your and then you can find a middle space, like, so I can take that element of your idea, I see that it's similar to this element of mine, let's pull them together, and then you can get to a space of compromise that you're more comfortable with. You often find that when you do that, you can like get more comfortable with people having ideas that are maybe a bit different from your idea. Paula,
Yes.
do you want to kind of talk just one more point, and then I think maybe we'll do Q&A. What do you think?
Perfect. That sounds great. I also just want to say what I'm hearing an echo of my voice. Sorry. What you said about making sure, thank you, it's gone. Making sure that what you're about to share ties back into the story is such a beautiful point and so well said. That was just really great. So one thing I will say, as speaking to leads specifically, I have found as a lead and as a writer in the room working for leads, the lead should actually be talking the least. I feel like this is maybe a misconception. A bad way to be a lead is to use your writer's room as your like little idea tank, where you just like come in, get all your ideas, and then you're like, okay, great, thanks. And then you go away, write the thing. And the next meeting, you're like, hey, look, I wrote our story. Everyone in the room is going to be like, oh, cool. That was great, you know? So I think the way to do it is to actually talk less, use your team more. And that can be counterintuitive because you're supposed to be the leader and you're in charge and you have, you know, this higher role and it's exciting and you've earned it. So good for you. But I think asking questions, letting your writers speak up more, it actually makes you a stronger leader. And it is a counterintuitive thing, but asking them questions instead of dictating what you think that where you think the story should go is such a good practice to have. And it can feel silly because you're like, aren't I supposed to be in charge? And I'm asking these people, well, what do you think this character would do? Or what do you think should happen next? But it's such a generous and I think fruitful practice to get into. And it creates a really nice power dynamic in the room. And when you do have to go away and make sweeping editorial decisions, as you will, acknowledging when you come back and you've done your writing or you've turned in the thing because it had to be done, saying like, and that was, you know, Amy-Leigh's great idea, or that was Paula's great idea that was put into this, and acknowledging and thanking your team is such a great thing to do. And a don't.
Did you say asking questions, Paula Rogers of Sweet Baby Inc?
Maybe
we should ask some questions now.
Let's do it.
Yeah. Does anyone have any questions for us? Please have questions for us.
What a beautiful segue that was. I'm going to pass the mic over, put your hands up, and we will get them all answered.
Yeah, we got hands at the front. Oh, we got hands at the back. Okay, hands at the front, you're going to get tired. Just wait, we'll get to you.
Hi, thank you very much. That was a really good talk. My question is about balancing the need to have everyone heard and to obviously you respect the other people in the writer's room with the necessity of making decisions and getting things done. Because I know I've certainly been in writers' rooms where we obviously want to listen to everyone and we want to keep bouncing ideas of everyone, but coming to a consensus and deciding what we're actually going to do can be quite difficult because you want to keep going and going and going forever, and it's great fun. My current strategy for that is just, you know, practicing the good meeting hygiene of we need to make this decision now, but that can feel quite authoritarian sometimes. So do you two have any strategies that you use in that situation?
So I have thoughts on this. Paula, I imagine you will also have thoughts on this.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah? So I feel like that kind of links back to what we were talking about with this idea of while responsibility can be flexible, it shouldn't cease to exist. And so when you have your person that knows about dragons and you say, check in on all the notes about dragons, they are the person that says, yeah, that's cool, about dragons, about the dragon lines. And I know that it's a bit of a silly analogy, or maybe it's not a silly analogy, but I think it can be applied to every kind of circumstance. And I think it can be thought about very analytically of, okay, who is the person who is the decision maker on this thing? Who is the person who signs off on this thing? I think that's your initial level. And then I think your level above that is the lead. Does the lead sign off on this now that it's finished? And that doesn't mean the lead reads every page of writing and says, this is good, this is bad. It means that the lead goes to the person who is the decision maker on that thing, and says, how are you feeling about that? Did it feel good to you? And they're like, yeah. And then the leader's like, cool, I sign off, we're good. You know, like I imagine you will think a similar thing, Paula. I know we're very similar on this.
Yes, I relate to this question. It was an excellent question so much. And in addition to everything Amy-Leigh said, I would also say, don't be afraid of decisions. Don't be, if they're not seen as a bad thing in the room, if they're not treated as like, oh, final no, decisions are progress. And although it closes down some options, it moves the story forward. So it presents new opportunities. You're making progress, you're moving forward. So don't be afraid of saying, well, this is how it's going to be for now. We're going to try it and move on. And don't have you can create a culture where making that decision actually is not a scary thing, doesn't feel final. Because I think intuitively, writers who are in that place where I think we're all just chatting now. We're not really working anymore. Everyone can kind of feel it. And so stepping in and saying okay, we gotta wrap this up. We gotta make a decision can actually be a welcome thing.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Cool. More questions. I'm looking at the clock tick down. I'm like, let's go. I'm gonna have to speak faster.
Hi, wonderful talk, by the way. Thank you so much. I just kind of a question about the dragon person, kind of in general. How do you become the dragon person? What's the process in being how do you start that conversation of your passion within writing to move that into the writer's room without, kind of butting and being like, I like this, give me work that's like this. Is it tough to do a portfolio, or is it more moving towards what you do now, really?
So, in the context of submitting a portfolio to get a job on a writer's room that you haven't been in before, I would say thread things and interests into your portfolio. And I would say that because I think that those things are more strengths than your capacity to put words on a page. Lots of people can put words on a page, but you might be the only person who is into dragons and deep tragic romance. When you're applying for a project that is about someone who has to kill a dragon but then gets stabbed and his wife sees and he's very sad, and that when you're applying for a job, that's what you do. When you're in that room and you want people to know about you, talk about yourself. I think it's very easy to feel like, oh, no one wants to know about me. No, I'm a big person that does this. I'm like, no one wants to hear about me. Oh, I'm gross. Nah, people do, and people want to hear about other people, and people want to know what you like. And no one is hearing you say, oh, I like dragons, and being like, ugh, guy thinks he likes dragons, but he doesn't even know about dragons, I've talked too much. Paula.
Yes, absolutely. I think, what Amy-Leigh is saying is so true. Put it in your portfolio, talk about it. My own example is, I minored in American history. I studied utopian communes as an undergrad in addition to writing. So I really, really like talking about that stuff. And I really like talking about the Victorian era. I'm that person. That's my dragon. And so I think knowing that for me, as my identity as a writer, if I'm on a project that's using that kind of information and I'm not able to talk about it or to contribute, also knowing that maybe this isn't a great space for me, or maybe I need to have a conversation with my lead to let them know that I am this resource. I think it's communicating that you have these interests, not being ashamed of them, knowing that it is a strength and it's something to be proud of, and that it should be seen as this wealth of information and knowledge, but also knowing yourself and knowing if I can't be the dragon person, I need to find somewhere that I can be the dragon person. Dragon person is our title of our talk.
Okay. Oh, are we out of time? I think we might. Do we have time for one more question? No more questions. There'll be no questions. Oh, you've been granted your question.
Wonderful. Thank you. Great talk. You mentioned about working on multiple projects at the same time. Say, for example, in each project, there's a character that is very similar to each other. So aside from taking extensive notes, how can you prevent yourself from, say, working on character A and going, oh no, I've written what should be for character B for character A, if that makes any sense at all?
I've written twins before, and the answer was to like have a bunch of. Am I allowed to do light cursing? Like have a load of shoot the shit conversations about. That's light cursing, right? Yeah. Have a load of shoot the shits about these characters and find the differences between them and make them distinct in your mind. We're being quick, so Paula, for you.
Yep. And the question was, if you have two characters who are very similar on different projects, how do you distinguish their voices?
Well, more preventing yourself from writing a section about character A and going, oh no, that was meant for B, but because they're similar, how do you stop yourself from making that mistake?
I think that just comes from knowing your character. The shoot the shit conversations, as Amy-Leigh said, are great. I'm a big proponent of this book that I keep handily on my desk, John Truby, The Anatomy of Story. He talks about always grounding your characters and their needs and wants, their fears, their weaknesses. This kind of goes back to what I was saying about character dreams earlier and things that like you might never use, but will keep them distinct and be a full person in your mind. So if you know that like maybe they present very similarly, but one is afraid of spiders and the other one isn't, that can be enough of a way in to differentiate those voices.
Thanks so much.
Yeah, so I think that's us. If you had questions and you didn't get to them, I'm here. Like, come and ask me your questions and I'll answer them for you. But Paula will not be, so please give Paula your love. She's done great.
Thank you. I'll just... Wow. Thank you so much. And you can find me on Twitter. I'm at Paula_bot. You can find me on the sweetbabyinc.com website. You can also find me at paulacreative.com. Thank you so much.